Good morning. Thank you for joining me for another 5 good minutes with the Word. I'm Barry Bryson, and we're continuing our study of the Thessalonian correspondence, and we are beginning the book of 2 Thessalonians today. So we want to take a day, our session, to introduce 2 Thessalonians as a separate letter. We also are going to take our next session to talk about the man of lawlessness, who looms as such a large figure in chapters 1 and 2. And then we'll get into the text. Let's begin by talking about 2 Thessalonians as a true follow-up letter, in the way 2 Corinthians is a true follow-up letter to 1 Corinthians, and the first letter occasions the second, or in the case of the Corinthian correspondence, perhaps the third. In 1 Thessalonians, in our study of 1 Thessalonians, we mentioned that Paul had written 1 Thessalonians within being there, within a few weeks of having been there. And we also mentioned that he only got to spend about 3 weeks with them. And so this is a brand new congregation. And that the Thessalonian correspondence is a wonderful window into the primary teaching of the gospel when Paul went into a new town, because we get to see the things that he emphasized. And one of the things that he emphasized quite clearly in those 3 weeks he was there, and let's remember, some of the people had only been Christians for a few days when he had to leave. One of the things he emphasized while he was there, in addition to their conversion and loving each other and steadfastness, holding on to your faith, was the second coming. In fact, we mentioned in chapter 1 of 1 Thessalonians that this love letter that 1 Thessalonians is, Paul uses them as an example, and will continue to use them as an example of a healthy congregation, and mentions the qualities. And the qualities that we identified in chapter 1 was their love for each other, their true conversion, their radical conversion, their commitment to the truth of the gospel, and their waiting for the second coming. Their very keen sense that at any time Jesus could come again. This was so imprinted on them from the start. We see this in the Thessalonian correspondence, that if they learned anything, they learned this. And both 1 and 2 Thessalonians are written to clarify and to refine their understanding of what Paul began teaching them when he was there. In 1 Thessalonians, he addresses a question that Timothy had evidently brought back, which is, what happens when people die before the second coming happens? Are they going to miss out? And he addresses that and says, absolutely not. In the end of chapter 4, the dead in Christ shall rise first, then we who are alive and remain will be gathered together with them and meet the Lord in the air, and we will always be together with the Lord. So this letter is having to be written, and we don't know how he knows this, but word has gotten to Paul that there are further misunderstandings about the second coming and the nearness of the second coming, and it seems that people, and we'll talk more about this in the second half of chapter 3, have stopped working, they've quit their jobs, they think it's happening tomorrow, so what's the point, of planting a garden or going to work, or, because it's this imminent. And they've also been evidently fed, perhaps, and we'll see this perhaps as we get into the text itself, some misinformation about the nature of the day. So, and so we do want to remember that this is really the reason. And it has a different tone from 1 Thessalonians. It's warm, it's loving, but there is a sternness in the second half of chapter 3. And maybe sternness is too harsh a word. It's just no nonsense. He's not petting children anymore. He's expecting them to grow up a little bit and to be able to think on for themselves a little bit. And of course, he continues to be proud of them and to use them as an example, which he does in 2 Corinthians chapter 8. So we know that they come through and that they do attain this maturity, but there is that difference in tone. As we mentioned, and we'll talk more about tomorrow, the second coming and the nature of the second coming is really the main topic. And we start talking about it in chapter 5, verse 5 of chapter 1, and we talk about it all the way to the end of chapter 2. So more than half the book is really concerning the nature of the second coming and what has to happen before that event can take place. And there are details that are tough to figure, tough to process. And there is this man of lawlessness, the son of perdition, that looms large. He's not mentioned until the second chapter, but he looms large really in the whole conversation about end times and what has to happen first. And so, anyway, we'll need to spend some time talking about him. I will say this: Kelsey, who wrote the commentary on the Thessalonian correspondence for the Sweet Commentaries, which came out in the 60s and 70s and are out of print now, which is a travesty because they're my favorite Church of Christ commentaries. Anyway, he calls 2 Thessalonians the hardest book in the Bible. And sometimes I feel that way too. Just one more thing. He ends the letter, and we'll talk more about this when we get to the text, by saying, I've written this in my own handwriting, or at least written the greeting at the end in my own handwriting. This is my distinguishing mark in every letter. This is the way I write. It seems that Paul might be worried about counterfeit letters from him, and so he's giving them a handwriting sample to compare with, and that makes you wonder if the problems that they're facing are not just external persecution, but nefarious actions by maybe the Jews or Judaizing brethren. And Paul's trying to make sure they know what's truly from him. We're going to talk a bit about the man of sin, or the man of lawlessness, and who he might be next time. Thank you for joining me for another 5 good minutes with the Word.